Welcome to Season 1, Episode 1 of the OpenAPI to OpenAPI series. In this episode, we will learn how to take a JSON file, import it into the repository, create a hierarchical structure with a doc root at the top, and then export this content into another JSON file so that we can validate the generation process. We will use Swagger to verify the accuracy of the generated output. We will also explore how to create or update API content in the repository using a diagram editor called the Repository Explorer view. So let's go into QualiWare. This is an empty repository. There is no content yet in the API portion of the repository. You are likely already familiar with work models in QualiWare. These models document approaches or methods and define project activities that can be triggered to apply actions that affect the repository. For example, we can see here that the steps instruct us to locate the API file, create a doc root instance, load the file into the doc root as a text field, and then generate a full hierarchy of the OpenAPI elements based on the imported content. Because this can also be performed using the Tools menu, we will use that option. By selecting Import OpenAPI, I am prompted to choose the source file, in this case, the pet store file, and then to indicate whether I want to reuse existing content. This reuse option applies not only to content within the file, but also to reusable components defined in the file, such as schemas. These schemas may be referenced multiple times, for example, when defining request bodies or the content of operation responses. Yes, I want to reuse the templates. These templates have been defined using variables that can be updated by the user. Here, I choose to reuse them. I am now asked to name the doc root at the top of the API hierarchy. I name it Pet Store, following the file name. We can now see that the repository has been populated with a significant amount of content. If I open the Pet Store doc root, it has been filled with content under the Path section and the Components section. If I click on the Pet Store node, I can see the reusable content defined in this API file and referenced in other elements. We will review this in more detail shortly. The doc root is also associated with general information describing what this API is about, its purpose, contact information, title, and other metadata. We can also create a doc root structure. This structure provides a manageable hierarchy of the API content and can be edited using the Repository Explorer view. Let me create it now. Because we have references defined in the Components section, such as schemas reused in request bodies or nested within other schemas, we are asked whether we want to fully expand these schema references or restrict the expansion to 2 levels. For example, the pet schema contains a property called category, which references the category schema. That schema, in turn, defines a set of category values. This creates a 2-level expansion between the pet and category schemas. Here, I choose full expansion. This generates the structure and opens the Repository Explorer view. Like any diagram editor, the Repository Explorer view includes a symbol bar and 2 panes. One that displays the hierarchy and another that shows the content of the selected node. We will use drag and drop actions from the symbol bar to build out the structure. Let's explore how the Pet Store structure is defined. If you remember, the Pet Store doc root template includes 2 main sections, paths and components. If I open the pet schema, we can see a set of properties, some of which are further defined. Category, for example, links to the category schema, which has its own properties. Both the pet and category schemas have a property named ID. Although they share the same property name, these represent different identifiers. Common properties such as ID, name, status, URI, or labels often appear in many definitions. As a result, multiple instances with the same name can exist across different contexts. If we continue and open a path item, we can see that it contains 2 operations, put and post. If I expand the request body of the put operation, I see that it supports 3 different schemas depending on the content type: JSON, XML, or URL encoded data. If I expand the put JSON request body, I see that it references the pet schema, defined earlier in the component section. This is not a separate definition, it is the same reusable schema. Because it is reused, we can explore its complete structure here. Up to this point, we have seen how to load an API file and navigate through its hierarchy. We can also create an entirely new hierarchy from scratch, which we will do after generating an API file from this existing content. API generation is also described in a work model. First, you select the doc root to use as the source, then run the content generator. This can also be done via the Tools menu using Export OpenAPI. So let me go to Tools. Export OpenAPI, select the pet store doc root, and export it under the name petstore2gen to ensure it is a new file. The file is generated and can now be used outside of QualiWare. To verify it, I import petstore2gen into the Swagger editor. It validates with no errors, confirming that the API definition is valid. Now, let's create an API hierarchy entirely from scratch. For this, I will create a doc root named Pet Management, as well as a doc root structure that I call Structure of Pet Management, and I open it. Since it is an empty structure and I have not yet specified which object is the doc root, it only provides a basic skeleton. I now need to create the first child, which will be the doc root for this structure, and I select Pet Management. If you remember, we need to define a paths section with path items and a components section with at least schemas. To do this quickly, I will create only one path item, one operation within that path, and one schema within the components section. Here, I add a path item named /petpn. This is the syntax. Since I created a path item, I can now create operations. I create a post operation named postPetPN. I could either continue expanding postPetPN or define at the pet management level a components section, which I also call pet management. The names I give follow the OpenAPI naming syntax. Back in this post operation, I will define how the input is structured. For this, I use a request body that I name postPetPN request body. For this postPetPN request body, I define the schema of the content and give that schema a name. I call this schema postPetPN request body schema, and I specify that the content type is JSON. This postPetPN request body schema references an actual schema called petPN, which I will now define in components. I create a schema called petPN. PetPN is defined with a set of properties. One called ID, one called name, and one called status. As I mentioned before, ID, name, and status are common property names, but their exact meaning depends on the context in which they are used. For this particular property, status, I decide to reuse the status definition that was created for pets. Now, I am done defining the structure of this doc root. The only thing missing is the general information about this file. So I go to the pet management doc root and fill in the missing elements. Here, I specify the version of the OpenAPI specification I am using, which is 3.0.1, and I give a name to this info object by creating a set of properties associated with the general information for this file. I name it pet management info. Now I can specify which fields are required. Not everything is required. Some elements are required, such as a title, in this case pet management, a version of this file, for example 0.9, and possibly a contact. This is sufficient to perform a generation. Now that I have defined this pet management API file, I can generate it by exporting this content into a file. I select the doc root I am starting from, pet management, and I give the file the name Pet Management. Then I go to the Swagger editor and verify that I did good work. I import the file petmanagement.json. There is an error. There are missing responses. I forgot to define the responses, so I go back to my structure of pet management. I add responses to my post operation. My first response is 200, for example, and I know that I need to provide a description for it, so I add a description called successful operation. I then provide a second response just to be complete, which is 405, and I also provide a description, invalid input. I save it. I can verify that it was added to the pet management doc root, but I will directly export this OpenAPI definition. I export pet management, and it replaces the existing pet management file. I import it again into Swagger, and this time it is okay. You can see that when I reuse status, I reuse its specification. It is a string with an enumeration of values, available, pending, or sold. So this concludes episode 1.